Now, as I'm sure most of you know, when Congress set up the Federal Reserve System, they set it up in a unique way with 12 regional Federal Reserve banks spread around the country. And one of our jobs is to represent our region when we go to Washington, D.C. And so as part of that, a number of us here spend a lot of time out in the district talking to communities about the matters that matter most to them. And one thing we've been hearing for some time now is the number one issue is housing. So I'm very much looking forward to continue learning from all of you both later tonight and tomorrow, and then sharing some of what I've learned as I go out around the communities. So we're now going to move to our keynote lecture part of the evening, where we're going to hear from journalist and author Lawrence Lanahan. He's going to be able to tell us a little bit about the lived experience of people who sit between communities and housing policy and how that affects their lives. Now, my job's not to introduce Lawrence. My job is to introduce the person who is going to introduce Lawrence. Nobody introduced me, but that's okay. And that is Tracy Scott. Tracy is the interim CEO of the Minneapolis Housing Authority. She has a wealth of experience in housing, having worked at the Atlanta Housing Authority. She is also the newest member of the Institute's Community Advisory Board, a board that helps us communicate with members of the community so that they can let us know of emerging issues of importance to them, and also help us transfer some of what we've learned back down to the community level. So we're very excited to be working with Tracy over the next year or two or three, hopefully many years. So I'm going to call Tracy up to the podium, but as she gets up here, I just want to let you know we've been recording everything at this conference so far, and we will record Lawrence's talk. But at the end of that talk, we're going to turn off the cameras and then open it up for a question and answer session. And the idea being that we don't want anyone to feel at all inhibited about what they want to say. So hopefully we can get a nice, lively discussion going there. But for now, welcome Tracy to the stage.
Good evening. I'm honored to be both on the newest member of the board, but also to be asked to take on a duty very quickly. So I welcome you and to the Fed and to this conference, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker. He's a musician, so I thought I would come up with something sort of music-y to get to the theme. That's right. Yeah, I'm not going to sing, though I can. Someone said that if you want a song to be happy, and you want it to sound happy, and you have happy lyrics, that you actually have to make the tune a little bit sad, because the contrast is what's important. Another way of thinking about this is the only way to understand darkness is to see light. You need the contrast. Or for those of you who are into books, then there would be like a Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. You know, it's sort of black, white, rich, poor. All of these contrasts are what help us to understand issues. And our speaker today, Lawrence Lanahan, has written two tales of one city, about two families with contrasting experiences of the affordable housing, desegregation, and deconcentration policies that both propelled a city called Baltimore and a region called Baltimore Region forward and yet held it back. So many cities experience this push-pull of trying to undo historical and systemic wrongs. In the Twin Cities, as we look out here on this beautiful river, we have our own challenges. Restrictive covenants, exclusionary zoning, continue to weigh down and hold back the progress and the ability of African Americans, Latino, First Nation residents to build wealth. And despite the newer policies and the laws and all of the things that President Bender talked about earlier in our sessions, every time I drive down the interstate highway here, I'm reminded that it mimics the red lines and that the past is not easily undone. So our speaker has given us a glimpse into Baltimore's tragic and instructive experience that after 30 years, they may actually be making progress in writing itself. Lawrence Lanahan is a Baltimore-based journalist and author of the book, The Lines Between Us, Two Families and a Quest to Cross Baltimore's Racial Divide. The idea for the book started as an award-winning multimedia series that he produced for WYPR, Baltimore's NPR station. For over a decade, he has worked in print and radio journalism, publishing with outlets such as the Columbia Journalism Review, the New York Times, Al Jazeera America, and public radio programs such as Marketplace and Morning Edition. He holds a journalism degree from Columbia University and a master's in sociology from American University, and has taught at the University of Baltimore, Goucher College, and the Goucher Prison Education Partnership. When he's not busy being a father to 2 sons, a husband, and writing books, by the way, he's a musician with the band aptly named Disappearing Ink. So I'm glad that the ink for this book is still visible, and he's going to talk to us about the lines between us. In this book, Lawrence reminds us that this is not his story or his experience. Rather, he uses the power of story as a lesson to policymakers who seek to move society forward. It's a story about a region that is hyper-segregated and full of divides that are not easily described in binary terms of black and white and good or bad. It's a story of well-intentioned churchgoers fighting to create community where others may see them as interlopers. It's a story of a young mother fighting to make the system work to change her legacy and her son's future. And it's a story of a tireless advocate for poor, disenfranchised black and brown people in the Baltimore region. Ultimately, it's a story of the all-too-common American experience, this unfathomable paradox of 400 years of racial violence and inequities in a society that speaks of universal rights and truths. This is multiple tales of many cities. And there is light, but first we have to see, and we have to bear witness and understand the darkness. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, writer, journalist, Baltimorean, Lawrence Lanahan.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Is my mic on? I would like to just keep listening to you talk. Not because you're talking about my book. I'm a radio producer, and I know a good talker when I hear one, and so I really appreciate it. We think about music the same way. We've got to talk about that later. So I was gobsmacked that anybody wanted me to come out here and talk about my little Baltimore book. I know what people think about Baltimore, and so I'm really honored to be here, that you care about my city, and what people might learn from it. And so thank you to Brookings and to the Minneapolis Fed and to Jenny and Abby for making this happen, and right down to everybody who's going to clean this room up when we're all gone. It's a lot of work to make things like this happen, and I really appreciate it. So I do come to you from Baltimore. I'm going to be gracious as possible, but things might get a little salty. That's just the way we are. My perspective on housing is completely rooted in the place where I live. And as Tracy said, it's a hyper-segregated region. And it's very clear in Baltimore where the opportunity is and where it is not. Given where we are, I think a lot of you know what kind of map this is. It's an opportunity map. You take all the variables like poverty, schools, jobs, you mash them together into an index, and you show where the opportunity is. The opportunity is abundant in the red, lacking in the yellow. I grew up in the red. Like up here, I live here now. I spent 18 years growing up in the white suburbs, and most of the last 18 years in Baltimore City. It's been slow motion whiplash. In 2009, I took a job at WYPR to do some producing for public radio. Every story seemed to me to be rooted in structural racism, segregation, inequality. And so I said, let's do a series called The Lines Between Us. Every Friday morning, we'll talk about this stuff in a way that we don't normally in the region, because we have these two worlds. We'll get on the airwaves together, and we'll have the difficult conversations. We started with housing, because of course it's foundational. We went through the history, the segregation ordinances. Baltimore had the first ordinance in 1910 that said white people can't move to a majority black block and vice versa. We talked about redlining, we talked about block busting, all the things that created these patterns. Then we talked about the racial wealth gap and the way that the racial wealth gap maintained that. I interviewed an 88-year-old black World War II veteran. He used the GI Bill where he could. He got old, and he happened to live in Mondawmin, where 2 years after he died, the unrest would start in 2015. And he got ill, and he was getting short sale offers on his now foreclosed house for $11,000, $20,000. He bought it on the GI Bill, doing everything he was supposed to do for $6,000 in 1950. And all that happened was his neighborhood went from white to black in 4 years. We talked about the other facets of inequality that combine with segregation to squeeze poor black and brown communities. The regional economy, economic development, law enforcement, criminal justice, education. And so the final episode, I was like, let's have a public event. You know, we'll have some panels, we'll tape them, and we'll air it. Well, this is The Lines Between Us. That's the series. Anybody recognize who that is? The best reporter in the country, Nicole Jones. We had her and a whole bunch of great people, and we talked about this stuff. And the animating question that night was, what tools do local, state, and federal government have to dismantle the drivers of structural inequality? And we talked locally about zoning, protocols for low-income housing, tax credits, like real riveting public radio, other tax incentives. Federally, we talked about disparate impact and other equality directives, as Ala T. Johnson calls them, these nooks and crannies of American law and regulation that allow us some power to take on structural racism. When you can't catch the racist saying the racist thing, you can still use the federal purse strings when the effects of a policy are discriminatory. So we talked about affirmatively furthering fair housing, disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system. I quit YPR right after that series, and I pushed off from that question about what tools does government have for inequality. Freelanced a couple of years, and the animating question for me when I was freelancing was who gets to live where and why? And so I did lots of reporting on local, state, and federal government policies that perpetuated segregation, and then I wrote my book. And the idea of the book was I'm going to depict the life of a metropolitan region, not the city, because city problems are not exclusively city problems. The 2 vacants on my block in Baltimore are owned by people from the county. The life of a metro region in a way that refuses to look away from segregation and racial inequality. What do you get when you write that story? And I used narrative nonfiction. And a friend of mine who, I didn't know many people who had written books, but one friend said, write chronologically. When you're structuring the book, write chronologically. And I'm so glad I listened to her. So I just wrote. I wrote from the Fair Housing Act to the death of Freddie Gray. And then I started reporting. And I reported and wrote about what happened after that. So I follow a few major characters through 5 decades of structural racism in one place. And that's the book. And so there are 2 families, in fact. One is white, one is black. Both of those families, when whatever generation it was that came to Baltimore, both the white and the black families started in public housing. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't surprised, but when I started interviewing them, and both families told me, my granddad moved from Lynchburg, Virginia during the war that was a white family, to get a war job, and he lived in public housing. I was like, of course. And then the black family was like, my mom, family of sharecroppers, she moved up into black public housing in Baltimore. I was like, of course. So they had the same starting point. And so both stories are about pursuing opportunity. And of course, because wealth follows whiteness and blackness gets penalized, they had different experiences along the way. The white family, Mark Lang, he lives in Bel Air. It's a very white, pretty prosperous suburb where I happen to grow up, about 40 minutes outside the city. He and his wife, spoiler, find Jesus and decide that they need to live in solidarity with the black poor in West Baltimore. They moved to Sandtown across the street from Gilmore Homes, a project. And 10 years later, Freddie Gray was arrested around the corner. Nicole Smith, black woman, grew up in West Baltimore, some of the high-rise public housing. She's just trying to get her son out to the suburbs and give him some opportunity. And spoiler, she gets there. And so I follow her. And then, does anybody in this room recognize the name Barbara Samuels? Oh, good, read the book. She's a fair housing lawyer in Baltimore. And she got to Baltimore. She wasn't from there. Sorry, I always feel like I'm home. She was a legal aid lawyer. She represented public housing tenants. She just wanted to make sure they had a unit to live in, that it was maintained. Then she read all the history of how public housing got to where it is geographically and was like, no, I'm going to be a fair housing lawyer. The question is not like, can we keep them in the unit? It's like, why are they there? She became a fair housing lawyer and a very effective one. And the way that I think about Baltimore, the analogy I use is a petri dish. Another fair housing lawyer you might know, Michael Allen with Relman, Dana Colfax. He was like, one day he told me, like, Baltimore's a petri dish. Like, you've got these incredible conditions of segregation and inequality, but you've also had some really major experiments to abate those conditions. And so the characters, it's a trick. They're a Trojan horse. It's great stories. We all want to be read to and hear story time. But the characters are a way into those major experiments. You know, the two major ways that we deal with segregation and concentrated poverty, right, are place-based development. Let's bring the opportunity to the place where the poor people are. Or housing mobility. Let's get them out of there. Get them out to where the opportunity already is. And so the white family moves into Sandtown in the middle of this big effort, tens of millions of dollars being poured into Sandtown in this neighborhood transformation initiative. Mayor Kurt Schmoke and James Rouse, who built the planned inclusive city of Columbia in the Baltimore suburbs, Rouse and Schmoke got together and they were like, let's change one neighborhood. Jobs, schools, change curriculum and education, make this a place with the same crime levels and drug dealing and everything of a middle-class neighborhood where anybody would want to live. Ambitious, right? And so Mark's best friend had moved there 20 years earlier. And he had started a multiracial church called Newsong Community Church. They were under the spell of a civil rights movement veteran named John Perkins. And John Perkins, he believed that if you wanted to help a poor black neighborhood, you pretty much needed to live there. He said Jesus didn't commute in, back and forth from heaven every day. That you need to feel the needs they feel. You need to have the same things at stake. He's not saying like, hey, everybody who's white, move here now. They did some hard work to filter people out and tell them what it was going to be like. But some white people in Baltimore fell under that spell, and they started this. They felt like they called it the 3 R's: relocation, you move there; redistribution, your networks, your resources will follow you, whether you're white or black. If you're middle class or upper class, your resources will follow you, and reconciliation, racial reconciliation. You bridge racial and economic divides, and then the community development, economic development grows out from that. Okay, some people call it gentrification with justice. And so, Mark, 20 years after his best friend moves there, makes the leap himself. And at its height, Newsong Community Church, 150, 175 people every Sunday, college prep program, primary care clinic, jobs program. They started their own school, which the public school system loved so much, they took it. And they had an outpost of a Habitat for Humanity. And over 15 years, they did 300 houses. And they had relationships with everybody in those houses. All right, so Mark is my Trojan horse into place-based development. Nicole is my Trojan horse into housing mobility. Baltimore, there's this like narrative arc of housing mobility. It starts in Chicago with the Gautreaux lawsuit, goes to Dallas in the 80s for the Walker lawsuit. And Baltimore picked up on this in the early 90s. And when everybody got crazy about Hope 6 and wanted to knock down all the high-rise public housing, Baltimore housing advocates were like, let's do some metropolitan, scattered site, Section 8, whatever. Let's get public housing out into the suburbs. And Nicole used a mobility voucher, a Section 8 voucher that was only good in 75% white, less than 10% poverty areas. And so Barbara, we've got place-based development, we've got mobility. Barbara the lawyer, she's this way into several crucibles in which those two approaches play out and affect each other. When there are limited resources, Barbara insists, she hates when I talk about this as like place-based development versus housing mobility. She insists it's a both and. You don't have enough resources, people will scream at each other over whether you should put the money into developing the city or moving people out. She got screamed at. She got called the lady from the ACLU by a developer who was trying to develop in the city. So the main thing that Barbara did was file Thompson v. HUD. Has anybody heard of that lawsuit? Good, you have not. I'll tell you about it. It was, like I said, Baltimore, lots of cities wanted to knock down the high-rise public housing in the 90s, right? Maybe not such a good idea to just concentrate that much poverty in one place, and let's do mixed income with Hope 6. And so she had just been hipped to all this history, and she was like, well, here's the thing. You're going to knock down the towers. You must replace those units. Don't you dare put them back in the same place, because when you created public housing, you segregated it by race, and you put it all in poor black neighborhoods. Don't you dare do it again. You make sure that the suburbs take their fair share. And they filed this lawsuit. And so long story short, after a year and a half, they sued the city and HUD. And the parties all came together and came to a partial consent decree in 1996. All right, we'll do 1,300 of these mobility vouchers. We'll give public housing. And it was a class action lawsuit, 40,000 people, black people who had ever lived in public housing. We're going to create 1,300 mobility vouchers for white areas. And then, see, they didn't sue the counties. So when HUD and the city and ACLU came up with the settlement, the counties got wind of it, like, wait, you're moving 1,300 people out here? But they negotiated, and they got it through. I could have written a book about Thompson. Nobody had done it yet. But I wanted readers to see how this all plays out in people's lives around the region. And I wanted people to see how epic these efforts to desegregate, to deconcentrate poverty, how epic these efforts are at the systemic and the individual levels. When you see Mark cross this way into the cities, Nicole cross this way into the counties, the lines between us stand out in very sharp relief. And I wanted people to see the results. You do see some historical achievements, but you do see the region get very little purchase on equity and desegregation overall. So what I wanted to do is tell you just a couple of stories. Oh, here's Mark and Betty that moved to Sandtown. Here's Nicole, moved out to Columbia. And there's Barbara giving somebody hell at city council. It was really fun reporting on Barbara Samuels. But I wanted to tell you just a couple stories from the book that I find instructive for the current moment that we are in, and make no mistake, we are in a moment. That's why we're all here. That's why what's in the news is in the news. There are great forces pushing us apart. I will say no more. And there are a few remarkable instances in housing and school policy in places like New York City, Oregon, Minneapolis, Howard County, Maryland, where policymakers are trying to push us back together. It's not a lot of bringing people together these days, but there's pushing people together. And so I want you to see some stories of how much work it took to make changes in the regional landscape in Baltimore. All right, so the place-based development, neighborhood transformation, comprehensive community initiative, whatever you want to call it, it means pouring tens of millions of dollars into a poor black neighborhood. That's what happened in Baltimore. They tried to change everything. They tried to make it community-led. They created this organization called Community Building and Partnership, but things were slow, and the city kind of rolled over that. They created hundreds of houses through the federal Nehemiah program in the early 90s, and they did all this stuff, so that was 1989. Well, here's another name I think some of you will know, Stephanie Deluca. You guys know Stephanie. Okay, another great Baltimore person. She studied what had happened and compared Sandtown to other poor black neighborhoods who had not gotten this intervention. And after $130 million is what she calculated went into this neighborhood, she said there was some improvement, the needle moved both ways, but not really any different than other communities. Okay, now people interpreted this as a failure. And I spent a lot of time in Sandtown. I got to know a lot of people who benefited from some of this stuff. I mean, it changed individual people's lives. But systemically, yeah, it didn't change a whole lot. And less than 18 months after this is when Freddie Gray was thrown in that police van. But at the same time that this is happening, Newsong Community Church is doing their thing, right? They're doing Habitat. They're not doing Nehemiah. They're doing Habitat for Humanity. That church has relationships with everybody in those houses. The people in those houses have connections to the church resources, which stem from that redistribution aspect, where primary care, jobs programs. So long story short, that is, the community is controlling their destiny through the kind of redevelopment that Newsong Community Church did on a much smaller scale than the large-scale top-down stuff that the city and the big developer tried to do. And this is the cleanup the day after the unrest in Sandtown. The lesson for me was just that housing alone, top-down stuff, just isn't enough. You can't put houses in and walk away. Building houses is just the beginning. You got to connect with existing community-led efforts, right? And compared to mobility, this is the truly epic work, going into these communities. I say going in because I think most of us don't live there, right? The lines between us are in this room, right? So going in and trying to do something is truly epic work. So another story is Thompson, right? So they have this partial consent decree, the vouchers that send everybody out to the counties. When you do a remedy in a big suit like that, the federal judge holds a fairness hearing and proposes the remedy, these vouchers, and what does the community think of this? And there are a lot of awful comments. One guy said, "Why should I bear the burden of living near public housing families when I don't urinate in the hallways or have illegitimate babies?" I mean, clearly he needs a lesson in the birds and the bees. But beyond that, that's an unlovely thing to say about the people who are living there. All right? That's the partial consent decree. Well, in 2012, they had a final settlement. 2,600 more of these vouchers. And this is what the judge said. He said, "Last time we had some ugly remarks. This time no one objected. No one objected." He said, "You did it so well, you being the people who have been moved." And then they approved 2,600 more of those vouchers. It took 16 years, but that is a major shift in the reality on the ground for housing. Baltimore stands out now in this brand new data on where families of color with vouchers choose to live. Most of the time, they're overrepresented in the city and underrepresented in the suburbs. In the Baltimore region, 1/3 of voucher-friendly rentals are in the suburbs. 1/3 of families of color with vouchers live in the suburbs. It's like Baltimore and Las Vegas, and I want somebody to tell me why Las Vegas is like an anomaly like Baltimore. I don't know what's going on there, but it's just Baltimore and Las Vegas. And the lesson in this story is sort of, here's the U.S. courthouse where Thompson took place, that if you appeal to the ideals in our equality directives, that we can take action when the intent is not clear, and the courts and the federal agencies have your back, you can make a lot of progress, much more progress than we've seen so far on place-based development. Now, though, not to say that couldn't happen in the future. And when I said houses won't do it alone for place-based development, just moving people doesn't do it for mobility. There's a lot of mobility counseling. The Baltimore Housing Mobility Program kept adapting as the program grew. They saw that people would make a second move, after they moved to the suburbs, and they put some money into counseling the second move. They paid for part of their driving school because they had moved them out to Baltimore's crappy there's no public transportation in the suburbs, So they helped them pay for driving school. I mean, they built relationships with landlords, so they're adapting and adapting. And there's been some talk of public hearings today. And so here's one. In 2011, the county council in Anne Arundel County, which is a lot of waterfront south of Baltimore, it's a very wealthy county, housing's expensive, they passed a workforce housing bill, 6-1, that if you promised to do some affordable units in your apartment development, you could go into an R2. I love that I'm in a room where people know what I'm talking about. R2, 2 units per acre, and build R22, 22 units per acre. You can build apartments in single family as long as you put some affordable units in. And they did that, and nobody used it. And then in 2014, a nonprofit developer said, "Hey, I want to do some low-income housing tax credit-backed, low-income housing in a high-opportunity area that's zoned for single family." There was a similar LIHTC senior housing complex, like right down the road. This is on Route 2, this major bus line between Baltimore and Minneapolis. Great spot for this. And so they're finally going to get some. And an important caveat is that one major obstacle to this happening was gone. The way that LIHTC developments used to happen in Maryland was the developer says, I'm going to apply for low-income housing tax credits to do some, an apartment complex. And they were required in Maryland to go get approval from the jurisdiction where they wanted to do it and get a financial contribution. And guess what the white suburban county said when they said, hey, I want to put some low-income housing in? Like, I can't find my pen. The city, like, yes, investment, absolutely, we'll take it. We have lots of poor people who would love to live in a nice brand new apartment that only costs $600 a month. And so Barbara Samuels, we'll keep coming back to her, she was like, you're totally segregated. You're the compounding segregation by putting all these low-income housing units in the city. So she filed a federal complaint. And so the state housing department was like, all right, you don't have to go get approval anymore. But if the county doesn't like the proposal, they can get together and vote as a council against it, and you don't get to apply for the low-income housing tax credits. And the fair housing people were like, well, that's half a loaf, we'll take it. And so as soon as that happened, somebody tried to build low-income housing in Baltimore County, and the Democratic council person, well, what happened, here's how like personal prejudices, or if you're being generous, preferences get institutionalized into policy. The neighbors start talking. They're going to put some Section 8 in apartments. And then the homeowners association or the neighborhood association gets together. Yeah, I don't know about this. So the neighborhood association wrote a letter to the developer and said, I don't care if you have 5% Section 8 or 100% Section 8. We don't want the burglaries, stabbings, and drugs. And so the Democratic County Council person convened the council, and they voted 6-0 to wipe that development off the map. The one black council person abstained. And so the next year, the fair housing advocates worked with the governor and the state housing department secretary to get a little bit of language in a rental housing bill that stripped local control, just stripped local control. And it passed right before they wanted to build this thing in Anne Arundel County. So Anne Arundel County had lost the ability to just wipe this thing out. So what happened was that neighbors started talking about this proposed thing. There's going to be some Section 8, building some apartments on Ritchie Highway, and the neighborhood association started talking about it. And one of the council people who had voted to pass workforce housing proposed a bill to roll this workforce housing back so that you could only do 22 acres per unit in 10 or 15 units per acre parcels. You couldn't do it in single family anymore. There was about 10% of the county that fit the bill. I mean, it was practically a ban on workforce housing. So much so that a former county attorney at the hearing was like, do you think we're going to get sued under the Fair Housing Act? And the council person said, oh, anybody can sue anybody for anything. This was 2 weeks before oral arguments started in the Supreme Court over disparate impact. And he was like, nah, we're good. And they voted 4-3 to roll it back. And so just in the course of less than 4 years, this gain was reversed. But 2 months ago, they got a new county executive, they got a new county council, and they passed 2 fair housing bills, the first fair housing law they've ever had on the books. They brought the workforce density bonus back almost all the way, and to boot, they banned source of income discrimination, so landlords can no longer say no Section 8. So 4 more years. So the lesson to me here is that that's one of the hearings, that political solutions can institutionalize fair housing and equity, or they can institutionalize prejudice. It depends on who's more organized. And speaking of organization, this is a story about my neighborhood in Northeast Baltimore. Part of the consent decree in Thompson said, not only do you do all the vouchers, Baltimore City has to put 40 units of hard units. Like go renovate some foreclosures and do some scattered site public housing in opportunity areas in the city, the few that we have. And so the city was like, all right, we're going to put a dozen in Northeast Baltimore. And word got out, and the neighbors started talking, and the families showed up to the Board of Estimate meeting where they were going to approve buying those houses. They canceled the purchase. They scheduled a meeting in the community for the city to talk to the residents, like, okay, here's what we're doing. Hundreds and hundreds of people showed up for this. It's a school auditorium, 700 people inside waving no Section 8 signs. There are 200 to 300 people outside the door going, let us in, let us in. I have the video, the VHS from the TV news. Let us in, right? 16 years later, Under Armour wants to build a new corporate headquarters in South Baltimore. And they want to do retail, and they want to do apartments. And they want a $535 million tax increment financing package from the city to do the infrastructure and make it all happen. And people in the city were like, maybe you'd like to give us something back. And so as part of their TIF application, they said, in these apartments, we're going to have high earners. We're going to have the creative class. We're going to have baby boomers. We're going to have millennials. And that was like, what about black people? And didn't really hear much about that. And so, because the creative class, the guy who invented that term measured it, that creative class is 8.5% black. They wanted to build this neighborhood on an 88% white peninsula in a 64% black city. And it wasn't exactly Columbia, which was built in the suburbs before the Fair Housing Act to include all races and economic levels. And so this is after Freddie Gray, and it was just like this civically urgent moment in Baltimore. So the Under Armour shows up to the city council to be like, can we get our TIF? And Baltimore showed up. And there were hundreds of people. And somebody came to the door and said, sorry, the room's full. And these people started chanting, let us in, let us in. Not to exclude people from their neighborhood, to include people in their new development. All right? And that is a story of organizing to me. A coda to that story, the person who sparked the opposition to the 40 or the 12 public houses that were going to happen in Northeast Baltimore, she had a change of heart. She met a public housing family. She saw the reaction at this meeting, was like, what have I done? And she got 500 signatures to bring public housing families to that neighborhood. She got 10 churches to sponsor people moving in. She took the petitions to the city housing commissioner, and he's like, okay. And they worked it out. And here's what's crazy. All right, so when this is how they organized. Good neighbors come in all colors. So when word got out about these 12 houses, people started emailing the city council. I've been living in Hamilton, that's my neighborhood, for 37 years. My daughters bought homes here. This is the final straw. We're putting our houses on the market. Are you not telling us who we must live with? And she did, in fact, sell her house. Well, remember I told you about Northeast Good Neighbors that organized to bring public housing families? All right, so look at the address, 2700 Gibbons Avenue, right? This person moved from that address. Here's a Northeast Good Neighbors meeting 3 years later. Look at the address. That's who the house turned over to, an organizer to bring the public housing families in. Guess who lives in that house now? Me. When I was digging through the archives, I found all that stuff. And the neighborhood has stabilized racially. Northwest Baltimore has the same housing stock. It turned over to all black. This neighborhood I live in now is about 55% black, 40% white. And it's just, to me, that's the kind of community that's worth investing in, right? To show that integration is valued. That's my boy. We went out for a walk, ran into our friends, and they're looking at a praying mantis. That's just like a normal day in my neighborhood. And the lesson here is to connect to the community. Northeast Good Neighbors, the Northeast Ministerium, the preachers that we're going to bring the public housing families in. Newsong Urban Ministries in Sandtown. There's a new group in Sandtown called No Boundaries Coalition. It is a neighborhood association of 5 neighborhoods from Sandtown, which is black, to Bolton Hill, which is white. It's a multi-neighborhood, multiracial organizing. They've done more to, get police reform happening in Baltimore than just about anybody. So those organizations are there to connect to. And so I think this is a moment, I mentioned it's a moment, and it's a moment that can be seized, right? Suburbanization in the first place was a major shift in where people lived, what communities looked like, and it was driven by a generation of veterans having a baby boom, right? That was a moment and a transformational one. Public housing-wise, this is some public housing going down in Baltimore after the consent decree. Public housing transformed in the 90s because of Hope 6. The towers came down. The Thompson case recognized the moment and hitched that moment to an obligation to repair what we had done before, and it was transformational in the Baltimore region. 4,400 families have moved from public housing out to high opportunity areas in Baltimore. It's not insignificant. It's a drop in the bucket, but it's not insignificant. So this is a transformational moment, and we could reshape where people live and what communities look like. I mean, why couldn't it be as dramatic as the process of suburbanization in the first place? That's Denver now. And it's not just housing. Like I said before, suburban housing came with highways. It ignited resistance to Brown versus Board. So this can't be done in a vacuum, right? School desegregation, public transportation, climate justice, all these things go together, and you can recognize this generational shift. Suburbanization had a generational shift, so does this. Minneapolis has a young mayor and city council. Baltimore's city council turned over after Freddie Gray, and half of them were under 35. They've gotten themselves an affordable housing trust fund. They have gotten themselves, now when you have legislation, each agency in the city has to do an equity report on the legislation. So whatever happens, I feel like if everyone is going to benefit and if the planet is going to benefit, it's going to be cataclysmic. Everything's cataclysmic now. I've come to call it the preposterous-scene era. Everything's preposterous. And, so this is a moment. And if it's going to be cataclysmic, why not now? There's an affordable housing crisis. There's pushing apart. Are we going to bring people together right now or push them together? And I mentioned earlier when I asked a question that Gallup did a poll. And, there's kind of a mandate, right? Gallup says that a majority of people, even a majority of white people, say school segregation is a serious problem. The federal government should do something, put low-income housing in high-income areas, redraw the school boundaries. And while we're doing something, take a look at that sign. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was driving around Baltimore County right before I started that series about inequality. I was like, wait, do good schools mean higher home values, or do higher home values mean good schools? And what are they trying to tell you? What are they trying to tell you with this sign? They're just copping to the way things are. White supremacy is always working against you. And I know that term sets some people off. I'm not talking about the white supremacy that happens under a white hood. I'm talking about white supremacy that happens behind a desk. The way it's being more commonly understood, it is a system that keeps white people on top. Supra in Latin means on top, above. And white supremacy as a system is reinforcing the political, economic, and social domination of white people. It trains people with means, and not just white people, to treat their children's well-being as inherently in conflict with the common good. We do not have to acquiesce to that equation. We don't. When no one acts to disrupt the white supremacist system, it perpetuates itself. That system is on autopilot. We programmed it so long ago, and we never deprogrammed it. And it's been that way a long time. Ida B. Wells, she talked about lynching, an excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property, and thus keep the race terrorized, wealth and property. Arnold Hirsch, he wrote a report for the Thompson case for the plaintiffs, and he was talking about slum clearance, public housing, urban renewal, and he said that those policies were permitted authorities to act on their segregative impulses in new and more effective ways, and they were doing it to uproot, consolidate, and contain Baltimore's exploding African-American population in the central city. Not only was there no question that such programs reflected the white consensus from the 1930s to the 1950s, but there's no indication they seriously considered any other course. If there were any shift in policy at all, it involved perceptions of white needs and desires. Okay, so that's 50 years, 70 years after Ida B. Wells. 2016, Department of Justice writes a report on unconstitutional policing in Baltimore. Baltimore Police Department's zero-tolerance policing strategy has focused on predominantly African-American neighborhoods. that have been segregated for generations due to government policies that systematically prevented African Americans from acquiring wealth, an echo of Ida B. Wells there, and obstructed their ability to move into neighborhoods with better jobs or schools. From Ida B. Wells till today, there's always been a message in our political and geographical landscape that certain races belong in certain places. The Fair Housing Act was supposed to replace that message with something more inclusive. My book follows the Baltimore region, from the Fair Housing Act to the unrest following Freddie Gray's death, and by the time I get to Freddie Gray's death, it's very clear that the Fair Housing Act failed to do its job, and that the civil rights movement left a lot of unfinished business. Part of solving this housing crisis is finishing that business. You have to recognize the reality you're plugging yourself into. Whatever coordinated action is taken in this housing crisis, one must always ask, who benefits? That's the city council hearing about Port Covington. If you ignore the white supremacist aspect of our system, it benefits the same people it always has, overwhelmingly white people and higher income people, and we have to step in for certain constituencies. What are we going to do about people making less than 30% of the area median income? They have little power to shape this. In Baltimore, activists got an affordable housing trust fund, and they are organizing, and they have, when the money's coming from the Department of Housing and Community Development, they have met with them. They want equity first in decision making. They want permanently affordable housing, and they want money for community land trusts so the community can build wealth and control what happens in their neighborhood. And listening to people like me and like us is not enough. We have to listen to people in these communities. There's a professor at Morgan State in Baltimore named Lawrence Brown. He's writing a book that's going to come out in early 2020, and it's going to be much more prescriptive than what I wrote. And one of the things he's going to talk about is neighborhood-based reparations based on redlining maps. In the Thompson v. HUD trial, former city housing commissioner in Baltimore, Dan Henson, said, "Poor people aren't stupid. I mean, poor people just don't get asked a lot. If you open them up and begin to ask people what they want their community to be like, they will tell you. And I think once they tell you, you can't unhear them. You can only ignore them." Equity, racial justice, affirmatively furthering fair housing. This is not something that would be nice to have when you're reshaping the housing market. It's not value added. It's fundamental. Don't think of it as the cherry on top. Think of it as the bottom of the burrito. You ever had a burrito and they didn't take good care of the bottom of the burrito? What happens when they don't take good care of the bottom of the burrito? You get a big mess in your lap. This work needs to happen, and this is the last thing I'm going to say to you. This work needs to happen from the bottom up. And that's what I got to say from Baltimore. Thank you so much for having me come here, that you care about what's happening in my city and think there might be anything to learn from it. Usually we're just the butt of the joke, and it's extremely touching that you cared to have me come out and tell you about it. So thank you.